everyone. In the process of learning a subject, the most important and first step is to read the lesson, isn't it? In school, teacher makes us to read the lesson once before explaining. But at home, for the students who find it difficult to read the lesson and for the differently abled, we are introducing audio textbooks. These will help you to listen and read the lesson while going through the text. Our state government has provided us with PDF of the textbooks. So let us start reading the lessons. The first lesson in English subject of class 6 is Peace and Harmony. Let us start reading the lesson. Once upon a time, in a very thick forest, there lived many animals, birds, snakes and insects. They all lived together happily. They roamed about the jungle and played together in the open fields without any fear. The peacocks were very proud of their dances, but admired the melodious songs of the cuckoos. The elephants enjoyed watching the fish swimming in the pool. The pythons, which were blessed with long bodies, spoke well of the fine fur of the flat-footed rabbits. The tiny ants, which were always busy, tickled the dark buffaloes. They often held musical evenings in a large open field. The elephant and the deer danced. The miners and the parrots sang. The tiger and the bear exhibited gymnastics. They called the moon and his friends, the stars, to be the guests of honor at their musical evenings. One day, a jackal entered the forest. He was dirty, dangerous, and very cunning too. He told the elephants, "You are the biggest animals in the forest. Why do you want to play with the squirrels and the rabbits?" He poisoned the minds of the peacocks, saying, "You are the loveliest birds in the forest. Why do you want to praise the mynas?" The jackal then approached the deer and whispered that the tiger was waiting for a chance to kill them. Gradually, all the animals began suspecting one another. Earlier, they had lived together, slept together, and roamed around the forest together. Now they started to put up boundaries and build fences around their properties. They moved about individually or with their own group. Now it was easy for the jackal to hunt the smaller animals and the birds. And when the smaller ones cried out for help, no one came to help them. One by one, the little ones disappeared. The forest slept as the animals were afraid. There were no more musical evenings. The moon was sad. He cried. The moon thought for a while and decided to come down among the animals and the birds as a sadhu. As soon as the sadhu appeared in the forest, the animals and the birds approached him to narrate their tales of woe. They cried, sobbed, and blamed each other for disturbing the peace in the forest, and the sadhu listened to them. The sadhu brought together the lions and the rabbits for a common meal. He visited the python and the viper and had a long chat with them. He advised the eagle not to attack the little chicks that had lost their mother. The sadhu accompanied the tiger and the wild bear to the nearest market. He played with the bulbul, the owl, and the monkeys. But the jackal was very angry with what the sadhu was doing. He did not want the animals to live in peace and harmony, so he was waiting for an opportunity to attack the sadhu. One day, the animals, insects, and birds held an emergency meeting and they unanimously decided to approach the sadhu and pleaded with him to kill the jackal. The sadhu said, "I will not kill the jackal, but help you in a different way." When the sun went to sleep, the jackal came to the house of the hens to take a few of them for his supper. The sadhu, who had been lodging nearby, came out of the house and spoke to the jackal. "Take me today for your meal." The jackal, who had been waiting for this opportunity, dragged the sadhu and ran into the jungle. He took the sadhu to a lonely place, tore him into pieces, and ate him up. The animals were very sad, angry, and disappointed with what had happened to the sadhu. They were afraid that the hungry jackal would appear again the next day. Then they heard a strange noise. All of them ran in that direction. What they saw surprised them. They saw the stomach of the jackal growing bigger and bigger. It continued to bloat until it burst. Then they heard a soft voice. May my animals, birds, and insects live in peace and harmony. May there be no fences around you. May you sing and dance once again. Remember me and be not afraid. When they looked up at the sky, they saw the moon shining brilliantly, spreading milky brightness over the earth. The animals once again started to roam, sing, and sleep in peace. They broke down the fences which they had built. They invited the moon and the stars for their cultural evenings. Children, listen to the audio textbook once again and then mute the audio and read on your own. The first poem in our English textbook is I Want Peace. I am big and round. I wonder if there will be peace. I hear the sound of people who are being killed. I see the people crying for life. I want to help the poor people. I am big and round. I feel the weight of sorrow on me. I touch the feelings of the people. I worry about the future of the people on me. I cry for help from God. I am big and round. I understand the problems of the people on me. I say grace for all people. I dream about my past. I try to handle my sorrow. I hope I won't be destroyed. I am big and round. Listen to the poem once again, children, and then read it on your own. So in the extensive reading, we have this lesson, Grand Contest in the Forest. Let's start reading. The animals, birds and trees were excited. They began to prepare for the great day when they would give their best to the great one except the little grey squirrel. There was excitement in the air. There was going to be a grand contest. Everyone should show something special and the best one would be praised by the lords of fire, wind, water and sun. The animals and trees began preparations. I will shine like sparkling sunshine, said the laburnum. My flowers will look like golden raindrops. The Gulmohar said, I'll dress myself so that I look like the early morning sun, golden red spreading red. I'll offer the best honey I can find, shouted the bear. The elephant said, I'll get the best fruit, so fresh it would still be on the branches, and lay them at her feet. Everyone had something beautiful or wonderful to offer on the great day. Everyone except a little grey squirrel who talked sadly to himself. What does a little grey squirrel with black stripes have to offer? The Palash said, the forest will be ablaze with my beauty. Though late, I'll save some flowers. And though early, I'll make some flowers bloom, snapped the Gulmohar. The beautiful trees and creatures had started competing and fighting. My mangoes are ready, announced the mango tree. The peacock said, emeralds and turquoises are my feathers. The lark trilled, I'll sing a song beautiful and moving. The dove cooed, saying the great one would love her soft notes. Gifts and beauty abound, thought the squirrel in despair. He thought and thought, but I'll do what I can do best, he decided. He found hollow branches and filled them with as many nuts and seeds of different trees as he could find. The next day everyone was ready. The great one came. The air became soft and balmy. The streams tinkled as they tumbled over little rocks. Great one, here is my gift, said each, laying gifts at her feet. After everyone had given their gifts, the great one looked at the little grey squirrel and asked, Little one, why are you quiet? I have nothing grand to offer you. I don't glow or sing, but what I have, I give with my heart. And he scampered away. He returned dragging his dry branches. The great one looked grave. I see beauty in form and sound. All waited holding their breath. But the prize goes to the grey squirrel. For I can use the seeds and sow them. New life will burst forth. Trees will bear more fruit. It is a gift not only for today, but also for all our tomorrows. The creatures then marveled, saying, "How foolish we were to think only of the present." Three cheers for the little squirrel. The second lesson in English subject is Telangana, the pride of the people. Let us now start reading the lesson. Hari was sitting in the armchair and was reading the newspaper. Kiran, his son, observed the emotions appearing on his father's face. "Dad, what is special in the news? Why are you so emotional?" Kiran asked. "Today is the red letter day for us, dear. The Union government has declared Telangana as the 29th state of the country. It took years for the government to take this decision. Many people sacrificed their lives for our state. We need to remember the martyrs who sacrificed their lives for separate Telangana state. Now we have our own state with our own culture," Hari said. "Dad, please tell me more about it," Kiran requested eagerly. "Dear child, the long-lasting dream of our people has become true. The birth of our state has made our vision real. Now there are more chances for employment and inclusive development. Moreover, we can revive our culture, we can revive our language," Hari said. "Dad, is our language different?" Kiran asked. "Not exactly," said Hari. "It is a variant of Telugu, a dialect, but it has not been given the status of a language and was humiliated on many occasions. Even our festivals are not given much importance. Indeed, our Telangana language is part of our culture," Hari explained. "What are the special festivals of our state, Dad?" Kiran asked. "We celebrate the main festivals as well as the regional festivals. Festivals like Bonalu, Batukamma and Peerla Panduga reflect our life," said Hari. Meanwhile, Hari saw Lakshmi coming. "Now it's your mother's turn. She will let you know about our festivals," Hari said. "We celebrate our festivals with warmth and fervor. Bonalu, our state festival, is celebrated during Ashadam as thanksgiving to the goddess Mahankadi for fulfilling our wishes. We prepare rice cooked with milk and jaggery, put it in a ghatam, the decorated pot, and carry the pot in a procession singing songs. The fete culminates as the ghatams are offered to the local goddesses," said Lakshmi. Indu, Kiran's sister, joined them and said, "Yes, last Tuesday we saw the jubilant procession." Indu asked, "Mom, what about Batukamma?" "Batukamma festival is celebrated as part of Dashera. The festival has historical and religious significance. Women carry Batukamma beautifully stacked with Tangedu, Gunugu and Chamanti flowers to the meeting points, making circles around Batukamma. Women folk sing songs related to our culture. Later, the Batukamma are taken to the local tanks and streams to be immersed," Lakshmi explained. "What is Muharram?" Kiran asked. Muharram is celebrated in many parts of our state. It is the symbol of religious tolerance. During this, the Pirlu are kept in village points. The Pirlu are immersed in the local lakes and tanks. Indeed, our festivals and art forms symbolize our culture. They are reflected in our lifestyle," said Hari. "Our saris are famous worldwide," said Lakshmi. "The saris of Pochampalli, Gadwal and Narayanpet are very popular for their attractive patterns. Our weavers of Sirsilla produce saris that fit in a matchbox. The wooden toys of Nirmal steal the hearts of everyone. All this make our state great," said Indu. Besides, we have Jataras. The Sammakka and Saralamma Jatara of Medaram, Warangal is one of the biggest gatherings in the world. Lakhs of people take part in it. Moreover, there are several places of attraction in our state. Hyderabad, Nagarjun Sagar, Yadadri, Vemulavada, Alampur, Srirangapuram and Bhadrachalam are some among them, said Hari. We went on a tour to Nagarjun Sagar last year. We visited the museum there. It has a huge collection of antiques, said Indu. And the Salajung Museum of Hyderabad is one of the three national museums which has antiques and portraits collected by a single person, Kiran added. We visited the Golconda Fort last Sunday. There we saw the place where Bhakta Ramadasu was imprisoned. Indu added. Not only that, our great poets contributed to our rich culture. Bammera Potana's Bhagavatam is known for its literary fragrance. Kancharla Gopanna, known as Bhakta Ramadasu, made our literature great with his Kirtanas. Mallinganti Suri, Kaloji Narayan Rao, Dasarathi Rangacharyalu and Dasarathi Krishnamacharyalu are the jewels of Telangana, said Lakshmi. Oggu Katha is a very popular folklore, singing, praising and narrating the stories of Mallanna, Veerappa and Yellamma. The narrator and the chorus, two narrators, dramatize and transform themselves into the characters. Pirini Shiva Tandavam is the dance form originated in Telangana. It has historical prominence. During the dynasty of the Kakatiyas, the soldiers performed this dance as the invocation and dedicated it to Lord Shiva. This dance form was revived by Sri Nataraja Ramakrishna. Hari said, it is high time for us to remember our great personalities who dedicated their life for Telangana. The temples, the antiques, the art forms, the literature, and our language contribute to our culture and heritage. We need to preserve them. I hope our government will also take necessary steps in this regard, said Hari. The second poem in our English textbook is In the Bazaars of Hyderabad. Let us start reading the poem. What do you sell, O ye merchants? Richly your wares are displayed, turbans of crimson and silver, tunics of purple brocade, mirror with panels of amber, daggers with handles of jade. What do you weigh, O ye vendors? Saffron and lentil and rice. What do you grind, O ye maidens? Sandalwood, henna and spice. What do you call, O ye peddlers? Chessman and ivory dice. What do you make, O ye goldsmiths? Rizzlers and anklets and rings. Bells for the feet of blue pigeons, frail as a dragonfly's wing. Girdles of gold for dancers, scabbards of gold for the king. What do you cry, O ye fruitmen? Citron, pomegranate and plum. What do you play, O ye magicians? Spells for aeons to come. What do you weave, O ye flower girls? With tassels of azure and red, crowns for the brow of a bridegroom, chaplets to garland his bed, sheets of white blossoms new garnered, to perfume the sleep of the dead. The next lesson in extensive reading of our textbook is Bammera Potana, the jewel of Telugu literature. So let's start reading the lesson. Bammera Potana was the remarkable poet who was born in our state. He translated Bhagavatam into Telugu. He was born in Bammera village of Warangal district. He belonged to an agricultural family. His father was Kisanna and his mother was Lakshmamma. He never hesitated to work in the agricultural fields despite his interest in poetry. At the early age, Potana wrote Bhogini Dandakamu for King Sri Singhabhupala. Later he wrote Veerabhadra Vijayamu describing the adventures of Veerabhadra, the son of Lord Shiva. The main theme of the work was the destruction of the yajna performed by King Daksha in the absence of Lord Shiva. Potana was a devotee of Lord Shiva. Later he became a devotee of Lord Rama and developed interest in salvation. It is said that he was invoked by Lord Rama and took up the work of translating Vyasa's Bhagavatam into Telugu, which was later known as Potana's Bhagavatam. It is said that Lord Rama himself complimented the work. Potana himself credited this in his Bhagavatam. పలికెడిది భాగవతమట పలికించు విభుండు రామభద్రుండట నే పలికిన భవహరమగునట పలికెద వేరొండు గాథ పలుకగ నేల. దీనికి అర్థం రాయబోయేది భాగవతం రాయించేవాడు రామభద్రుడు. ఆ భాగవతాన్ని రచిస్తే మళ్ళీ పుట్టుకలేని మోక్షం లభిస్తుంది. మరి వేరే ఏవో కథలు రాయడం ఎందుకు? ఆ భాగవతాన్నే రచిస్తాను అంటారు పోతన మహాకవి. Potana dedicated his Bhagavatam to Lord Rama, refusing the orders of King Padmanayaka. He thought it would be better to dedicate the divine work to Lord Rama, not to any mortal king. Potana was fond of using rhythm and repetition of sounds. His descriptions touch the hearts of the readers. Even common people quote the verses of Gajendra Mokshamu and Prahalada Charitra from Potana Bhagavatam. Potana is not among us now, but his works live forever and ever. His poetry still rings in our ears. Third chapter in our English textbook is What Can a Dollar and 11 Cents Do? So shall we start reading? An 8-year-old child, Tess, heard her parents talking about her little brother Andrew. All she knew was that Andrew was very sick and her parents did not have enough money for the treatment. They were moving into a smaller house because they could not afford to stay in the present house after paying the doctor's bills. He needed a costly surgery now and there was no one to loan them the money. So her parents lost their hope and gave up their efforts. When Tess heard her daddy say to her tearful mother, "Only a miracle can save him now," she went to her room and pulled a jar of coins from a cupboard. She poured all the money out on the floor and counted it carefully, holding the jar tightly. She made her way to the medical store and placed it on the glass table. "What do you want?" asked the chemist. "It's for my little brother," Tess answered. "He is really sick and I want to buy a miracle." "We don't sell miracles here, child. I am sorry," the chemist said, smiling sadly at the little girl. "Listen, I have the money to pay for it. If it isn't enough, I can try and get some more. Just tell me how much it costs." At the shop there was a well-dressed customer. He bent down and asked the little girl, "What kind of miracle does your brother need?" "I don't know," she replied, with her eyes welling up. "He is really sick and Mummy says he needs an operation. But my daddy can't pay for it. So I have brought my savings." "How much do you have?" asked the man. $1.11. But I can try and get some more," she answered, barely audible. "Wonderful," smiled the man. $1.11, the exact price of a miracle for your little brother. He took her money in one hand and held her hand with the other. He said, "Take me to your home. I want to see your brother and meet your parents. Let's see if I have the kind of miracle he needs." That well-dressed man was Dr. Carlton Armstrong, a famous neurosurgeon. He had Andrew admitted to hospital where he operated on him without any charges. Within a few weeks, Andrew was back at home and doing well. That surgery, her mum whispered, was a real miracle. I wonder how much it would have cost. Tess smiled. She knew exactly how much the miracle cost. $1.11 plus the love of a little child. The third poem in our English textbook is A Nation's Strength. The poet of this poem is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now let us read the poem. Not gold but only men can make a people great and strong. Men who for truth and honor's sake stand fast and suffer long. Brave men who work while others sleep, who dare while others fly. They build a nation's pillars deep and lift them to the sky. Children, listen to the poem once again and read it on your own. Wilma Rudolph was born in a poor family in Tennessee. At the age of 4, she had pneumonia with scarlet fever, which left her paralyzed with polio. She had to wear a brace, and the doctor said she would never put her foot on earth. But her mother encouraged her. She told Wilma that with God given ability, persistence, and faith, she could do anything she wanted. Wilma said, I want to be the fastest woman runner in the world. At the age of 9, against the advice of the doctor, she removed the brace and took the first step. At the age of 13, she entered her first race and came way last. And then she entered her second and third and fourth races and came way last until a day came when she came in first. At the age of 15, she went to Tennessee State University where she met a coach by the name of Ed Temple. She told him, I want to be the fastest runner in the world. Temple said, with your spirit, nobody can stop you, and besides, I'll help you. The day came when she was at the Olympics. And at the Olympics, you are matched with the best of the best. Wilma was matched against a woman named Uta Hain, who had never been beaten. The first event was the 100-meter race. Wilma met Uta Hain and won her first gold medal. The second event was the 200-meter race and Wilma beat Uta a second time and won her second gold medal. The third event was the 400-meter relay and she was racing against Uta one more time. In the relay, the fastest person always runs the last lap and they both anchored their teams. The first three people ran and changed the baton easily. When it came to Wilma's turn, she dropped the baton, but Wilma saw Uta shoot up at the other end. She picked up the baton, ran like a machine, beat Uta a third time, and won her third gold medal. It became a history that a paralytic woman became the fastest woman on this earth at the 1960 Olympics. The fourth chapter in our English textbook is An Adventure. Let us start reading the lesson. Let's go, said Seema, or it will be time for lunch before we know it. Yes, let's go towards the old temple, said Arun, her cousin. As always, they had come to Vishnupur on a vacation to their grandparents. It was a small, quiet town surrounded by green hills and some ancient ruins. They particularly loved going for walks and spent hours exploring the old temple in a fort nearby. Sometimes they pretended to be rulers of an ancient kingdom. At other times, they played hide and seek. Catch me if you can, shouted Arun, and he ran ahead. I'll catch you in a minute, replied Seema as she followed. Arun was soon out of sight as he went round the corner. Seema knew his favorite hiding place and smiled to herself, thinking, he won't escape me. She ran down the hills towards the old temple where she knew Arun would be hiding. but he wasn't there. He must have gone to the cave, she thought. This was another favorite place for them, a cave hidden behind some creepers. Arun, I am here, Seema called out as she reached the cave. There was no reply. Seema could not see anyone. She was about to enter the cave when she caught sight of a piece of torn, crumpled paper on the ground. She picked it up and unfolded it out. How odd! It had letters CLP written on it. Just then she heard Arun calling out, Seema, where are you? Here, said Seema to Arun, who was standing at the entrance of the cave. I was looking for you. What have you got in your hand? Asked Arun. It's nothing, just a piece of paper with CLP written on it, said Seema. Don't throw it, let me see it, said Arun, as he took the paper from her. He looked at it carefully and said, See, if you look at the torn edge of the letter, which could be an E and not a C. Do you think it could be help? Asked Seema. Help? My goodness, someone is in trouble. We must find him, said Arun. Or her, added Seema. But where do we go? There is no one in the temple and there is no one in the cave too. Let's try the Meena Bazaar. There is a secret passage, said Arun excitedly. Meena Bazaar was once a popular market for royal ladies, but all that remained now was just a few crumbling walls. A secret passage was connected to the market. They ran towards it. There they found a man with his hands and feet tied up. He had a gag on his mouth and was struggling to free himself. The children removed the gag and helped him free his hands and feet. Hurry, the man said. The smugglers will be back. They ran all the way through the secret passage. They were soon out of breath. Don't stop yet, panted the man. They'll be back any moment. Soon they reached home. Their grandparents were surprised to see them. Now tell us who you are, Seema asked the man. And who tied you up? Added Arun. And why? Continued Seema. I will tell you the whole story. But first call the police, said the man. The police arrived in no time. The man they had freed was a police officer in plain clothes. He was following a gang of smugglers who had caught him and tied him up. Before that, he managed to write help on a piece of paper and had thrown it, hoping that someone would find it. They were going to kill me, but thanks to you, I am safe. We will now go and catch the smugglers, said the man. What an adventure! Wait till I tell my friends about it, said Seema. They'll never believe us, said Arun. That's enough, children. It is time for lunch, said Granny. Children, listen to the story once again and read on your own. The fourth poem in our English textbook is The Naughty Boy. The poet is John Keats. So shall we start reading the poem, children? There was a naughty boy, and a naughty boy was he. He ran away to Scotland, the people there to see. There he found that the ground was as hard that a yard, was as long that a song, was as merry that a cherry, was as red that lead, was as weighty that fourscore, was as 80, that a door was as wooden as in England. So he stood in his shoes, and he wondered, he stood in his shoes, and he wondered. Children, listen to the poem once again, and then read it on your own. Tanaji Manusare. This is our next lesson in extensive reading of our textbook. Let's start reading the lesson. This is a story from Maharashtra, a very inspiring story of a brave warrior. Tanaji Malusare was the name of the warrior. Perhaps no episode in Maratha history has moved the hearts of people as deeply as the death of Tanaji Malusare, the conqueror of Simhagad, the Lion's Fort. This story is known to every Maratha child through the ballad of Simhagad. The Simhagad fort was one of the 23 forts surrendered to the Mughals as per the Purandar Treaty. This act of surrender hurt the feelings of Marathas. There was fire in the hearts of Marathas. That fire would never subside till they take revenge. One morning, says the ballad of Simhagad, Jijabai, Shivaji's mother, was looking out of the window of Pratapgarh. She saw in the distance the majestic monument, Simhagad, the Lion Fort. She wanted Shivaji to win back the fort from the Mughals. But Shivaji thought that it was an impossible task. He knew that there was one man who can do this, and that was none other than Tanaji. He sent for Tanaji, but when Tanaji came, Shivaji did not have the heart to tell his dear comrade why he had been summoned. His mother Jijabai told him the nature of his mission. The lion-hearted Tanaji promised either to accomplish it or die in the process. He set out at night and marched towards the fortress with his men. He reached the fortress secretly on a cold, clear and moonless night in February 1670. He had taken with him Shivaji's favorite Ghorpad, Udumu, or lizard, to assist in scaling the fort wall. A rope was tied to the waist of the lizard. The lizard refused to follow the order and climb the fort as it noticed a danger in climbing the fort. Tanaji expressed his anger. The lizard obeyed his order. It was terrified and scaled the hilltop which helped the Marathas to go up the cliff. Some soldiers reached the top. The guards in the fort detected their arrival. The sentries were swiftly killed by the Marathas, but the clash of arms thoroughly roused the garrison. Tanaji faced a serious problem. Many soldiers of his troops were still at the bottom of the fort. Even then, he had to challenge the enemy that greatly outnumbered his troops. He has already made up his mind, and he ordered his troops to launch the attack. The fight proceeded. Tanaji lost many men, but his men caused heavy losses on the Mughal forces. Tanaji repeatedly sang to keep the spirits of his soldiers high. After some hours, the Mughal commander Udaybhan was engaged in a fight with Tanaji. The odds were against the Maratha. The long night march, the anxiety of the mission, scaling the fort, and the vigorous fight Tanaji had already been engaged in before had made him weak completely. Hence, after a lengthy fight, Tanaji fell, never to get up. However, the fight continued under the leadership of Suryaji, Tanaji's brother. The soldiers who were at the bottom of the fort reached the fort and continued fighting. The Mughals bit the dust. The Maratha soldiers brought the fort under their control. It was a great victory for the Marathas. But there was no mood of joy of victory in their camp. The news of the victory reached Shivaji. He rushed to the fort eagerly to congratulate Tanaji. To his shock, he saw the brave Tanaji lifeless. The ballad of Simhagad describes the grief as such. 12 days the king wept over him for the great love that he bore him. The sorrow of Jijabai was also described. The scarf removed, she saw his face. No worthier chief of the race. It was thus she wailed and drew a sword before the armies of his lord. Shivaji's son and king today, your right hand has been chopped away. When Shivaji learned of his friend's death, he remarked, Gad ala pan sinha gela. It meant we have gained the fort but lost the lion. The fifth chapter in our English textbook is Plant a Tree. Let us start reading the lesson. Trees are the most useful things in the world. Children play under them. Travelers rest in their cool shade. Trees give us fruit to eat and firewood to burn. We build houses and make furniture with the wood of the trees. We need trees for our lives. If there were no trees, there would be no life on earth. Living things, both people and animals, breathe in air. They breathe in oxygen from the air and breathe out carbon dioxide. If all the oxygen in the air was used up, leaving only carbon dioxide, what would happen to all of us? Everyone would die. But trees help us to live. They breathe in the carbon dioxide from the air and let oxygen out into the air. With the help of the sunlight, they break up carbon dioxide into carbon and oxygen. They use the carbon to make starch and let the oxygen out into the air. Trees make all the starch in the world. Starch is the most important part of our food. Without trees, we will not have any starch to eat. Trees help us to get rain. The leaves of trees breathe out a lot of water vapor into the air. This makes the air cool. The cool air helps rainfall. Rain gives us water. No one can live without water, and we need trees to get water. Trees have many more uses. The rubber trees grows in many parts of the world. From the sap of this tree we get rubber. Rubber is a very useful thing. Some trees like eucalyptus give us medicines. In South America, there is a tree called the cow tree. People drink the sap of this tree instead of milk. It is less expensive than milk. How long can a big tree live? Nobody knows. Some trees have already lived for more than 4,000 years. They can live for 5 to 6,000 years more. Some of them will live as long as 10,000 years. There is a tree called General Sherman in California in America. It is a huge evergreen tree. It is said to be several thousand years old. How do we know the age of a tree? Do trees have birthdays? Yes, they do. They even get gifts on their birthdays. They get rings. Every year, a tree grows a little bigger. As it grows, the trunk gets another layer of wood. It gets another ring. You cannot see the rings because they are inside the tree. But if you look at the trunk of a cut down tree carefully, you'll find the rings. One ring indicates 1 year. Some trees can live only for 5 to 10 years, but some can live for hundreds or even thousands of years, like General Sherman. Man cuts down hundreds of trees every year to build houses, to make furniture, to cook food, and to make paper. If this continues, one day there will be no more trees in the world. What will happen then? We all will die. So what shall we do? We should avoid cutting trees as far as possible. Meanwhile, we must plant a lot of trees. Every one of us should plant at least one tree every year. Children, listen to the lesson once again and read on your own. The fifth poem in our English textbook is If a Tree Could Talk. Let us start reading the poem. If a tree could talk, what would it say? Don't chop me down, just walk away. If a river could talk, what would it say? Don't dump in trash, throw it away. If the air could talk, what would it say? The factories must learn to keep smoke away. If the animals could talk, what would they say? Help us to live, we wish to stay. If the earth could talk, what would it say? Protect me by making every day Earth Day. Children, listen to the poem once again and read it on your own. Children speak up. This is the name of our next lesson in extensive reading of our textbook. Let's start reading the lesson. This is an extract from a speech given by Suen Suzuki, a 13-year-old girl from Canada on June 11, 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Hello, I am Suen Suzuki, speaking for ECO, the Environmental Children's Organization. We are a group of 12 and 13-year-olds from Canada trying to make a difference. Vanessa Suit, Morgan Gisler, Michelle Quigg and me. We raised all the money ourselves to come 6,000 miles to tell you adults that you must change your ways. I am here to speak for all future generations to come. I am here to speak on behalf of all the starving children around the world whose cries go unheard. I am here to speak for the countless animals dying across this planet because they have nowhere left to go. I'm afraid to go out in the sun now because of the holes in the ozone. I'm afraid to breathe the air because I don't know what chemicals are in it. I used to go fishing in Vanakkar, my hometown, with my dad, until just a few years ago we found the fish full of cancers. And now we hear about animals and plants going extinct every day, vanishing every day. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles, and rainforests full of birds and butterflies. But now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. Did you have to worry about these things when you were of my age? Here you may be delegates of your governments, business people, organizers, reporters, or politicians. But really, you are mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunts and uncles. And all of you are someone's child. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all part of a family. 5 billion strong, in fact 30 million species strong, and we all share the same air, water, and soil. Borders and governments will never change that. I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together and should act as one single world towards one single goal. In my anger, I'm not blind, and in my fear, I'm not afraid to tell the world how I feel. I'm only a child, yet I know if all the money spent on war was spent on ending poverty and finding environmental answers, what a wonderful place this earth would be. At school, even in kindergarten, you teach us how to behave in the world. You teach us not to fight with others, to work things out, to respect others, to clean up our mess, not to hurt other creatures, to share, not to be greedy. Then why do you go out and do the things you tell us not to do? Do not forget why you are attending these conferences. You are doing this for your own children. You are deciding what kind of a world we will grow up in. Parents should be able to comfort their children by saying everything is going to be alright. It's not the end of the world. We are doing the best we can. But I don't think you can say that to us anymore. Are we even on your list of priorities? My dad always says, you are what you do, not what you say. Well, what you do makes me cry at night. You grown ups say you love us, I challenge you. Please make your actions reflect your words. Thank you for listening. The sixth chapter in our English textbook is Rip Van Winkle. Let us start reading the lesson. Many years ago, at the foothills of the Catskill Mountains was a small village. In the village lived a simple, good-natured fellow named Rip Van Winkle. He was a kind neighbor, ready to help anyone. Everyone in the village liked him. The children of the village shouted with joy whenever they saw him because he played with them. He taught them to fly kites and shoot marbles and told them long stories. The only problem with Rip was that he was very lazy. He did no work on his own farm and just idled away his time. His fences were falling to pieces, his cow was going astray, weeds grew on his farm. Rip's constant companion was his dog named Wolf. To avoid work, he would walk away into the forest with his dog. One day, Rip just walked on and reached the highest part of the mountains. It was late in the afternoon when he reached there. Tired after his long climb, he lay down and began daydreaming. It was soon evening and he realized it would be night by the time he reached his village. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling out, Rip Van Winkle, Rip Van Winkle. He looked around and saw a short old man with thick hair and a grizzled beard walking towards him with a barrel. He made signs to help him carry the barrel. Rip hurried to help the stranger who caught his hand tightly. Together they reached a place where there were some more odd-looking short men playing ninepins. They were all dressed the same way and all of them had beards of various shapes and colors. Even though they were playing a game, their faces were serious and there was silence. The only sound was the noise of the balls which echoed in the mountains like thunder. As Rip and his companion reached them, they stopped playing and stared at Rip with a fixed gaze. Rip was really frightened. His companion emptied the contents of the barrel into glasses and made Rip drink it. Rip obeyed as he was trembling with fear. Since he was thirsty, he drank a few more glasses and slowly fell into a deep sleep. On waking up, he found that he was at the place where he had first met the old man. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. Surely I have not slept here all night, thought Rip. He looked around for Wolf, but he was nowhere. Rip whistled for him. Wolf, Wolf, he then shouted. No dog was to be seen. Where has this dog gone? He muttered to himself. He began to descend the mountain to go back to his village. As he neared the village, he met a number of people, but he didn't know any of them. The villagers also stared at him equally surprised. Who is this man? Said one. I have never seen him before, said another. Look at his long white beard and his wrinkled face. On hearing this, Rip stroked his chin and, to his astonishment, he found his beard had grown a foot long and it was all white. An old woman walked up to him and looked at his face for a moment. Then she exclaimed, It is Rip Van Winkle. Welcome home again, old neighbor. Where have you been these 20 long years? The sixth poem in our English textbook is My Shadow. I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. He is very, very like me, from the heels up to the head, and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. The funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow, not at all like proper children, which is always very slow. For he sometimes shoots up taller like an India rubber ball, and he sometimes gets so little that there's none of him at all. One morning very early, before the sun was up, I rose and found the shining dew on every buttercup, and my lazy little shadow, like an arrant sleepy head, had stayed at home behind me and was fast asleep in bed. The poem was written by Robert Louis Stevenson. Children, listen to the poem once again and then read it on your own. Gulliver's Travels. This is our next lesson in extensive reading. Let's start reading the lesson. When a person tells the story of his life in his own words, it is called an autobiography. Gulliver, a sailor, was once caught in the land of James. This is how he describes his experience. On the 16th of June 1730, we discovered land. Our captain sent a dozen men with vessels for water, if any could be found. When we came to land, we saw no river or spring nor any inhabitants. I went on to explore. The country was barren and rocky. I turned back to join the crew, only to see them getting into the boat and rowing for life to get to the ship. Before I could reach them, I observed a huge creature walking after them in the sea as fast as he could. The water of the ocean reached only up to his knees. However, the monster was unable to overtake the speeding boat. I turned back quickly and climbed up a steep hill with fields of barley on either side and corn rising up to 40 feet. There was a fence to pass from one field to the other. It was impossible for me to climb because every step was 6 feet high. I was trying to find a gap in the hedge when I discovered one of the inhabitants in the next field walking towards the fence. He was of the same size as the creature chasing the boat. I was struck with utmost fear and astonishment and ran to hide myself. He called in a voice much louder than a trumpet. It sounded like thunder. 7 monsters like him came towards the field ready to reap the corn. They carried a reaping hook which was very big. When one of the reapers approached where I lay hidden, I screamed as loud as I could. The creature stopped reaping, picked me up between his thumb and forefinger, and brought me close to his eyes 60 feet above the ground. He looked at me with curiosity and blew my hair aside to get a better view of my face. He called his friends and gently placed me on the ground. They all sat on the ground to take a good look at me. I walked slowly backward and forward, pulled off my hat, and made a low bow towards the farmers. I tried to speak to them loudly in several languages. Each time I did so, the farmer who picked me up held his ear very close to me, but in vain. The farmer took me to his house and placed me at some distance on the dining table, which was 30 feet high from the floor. Dinner was brought for the farmer in a dish which was 10 feet in diameter. The farmer's wife crumbled some bread and placed it before me. In the middle of the dinner, I heard a noise behind me. It was the purring of a cat that was 10 times larger than an ox. The farmer's wife was stroking him. Then entered the farmer's 1-year-old son in the arms of a lady. On seeing me, the child grabbed me from the table and put my head into his mouth. I shouted so loudly that the baby dropped me. I would have broken my neck if the mother had not held her apron under me. Later, she put me on her own bed and covered me with a clean white handkerchief. I slept dreaming of my home, my wife, and my children. Adapted from Swift's Gulliver's Travels. The seventh chapter in our English textbook is P.T. Usha, the Golden Girl. Let us start reading the lesson. P.T. Usha, India. This was the address on a letter from the Middle East. The letter was delivered by the postal department with no delay whatsoever. This was the status of Pillavulakkandi Tekkeparambil Usha, who was born as the second daughter of Paital and Lakshmi Amma on 20th May 1964 in the village of Payyoli, Kozhikode district, Kerala. It was November 1973 when a dedicated physical education teacher called Balakrishnan discovered Usha while conversing with a parent. His eyes, ever watchful, kept drifting to a group of small girls playing blind man's bluff just across the field. Was there a pair of feet that were moving extraordinarily fast? Was that tiny dark girl in her blue skirt and white blouse moving like an instinctive athlete? Patient as ever, Balakrishnan waited for the game to be over. Calling the little girl, he gently inquired of her, "What's your name, child?" The shy little girl hardly raised her eyes from the ground. "Usha," she whispered and added, "from class 4." Thus was made one of the greatest discoveries in the athletic arena of Asia. A simple question from an observant master and an equally unassuming answer from a tiny village girl from a distant village in Malabar in Kerala. That same evening at 4:15 p.m., Usha heard the magical words for the first time in her life. "On your marks, get set, go." The master had explained to her what to do and why. Confused, but very much aware of the seriousness of the occasion, she ran for her life. The rest is history. In 1975, Usha was 11 years old and was practicing vigorously for the sub-junior district meet, her first ever. With 3 days to go, Usha badly injured her heel while practicing for the long jump. The day of the event, all eyes were on her. She was so puny and unbelievably tiny that she was the crowd's favorite even before the race started. A white bandage on her heel won her even more sympathy. She came first in all the 4 events she participated in: 100 meters, 200 meters, long jump and high jump. She was also the individual champion at the meet. Academically, Usha was an extremely bright student. She was always amongst the top 3 in her class and was popular with her teachers. She passed her Standard 7 exams with a first class grade. Just then, the government of Kerala announced a separate sports division for girls at Kannanur, a town with special facilities for sports in addition to regular studies. Usha joined the sports division at Kannanur to improve her sport talent. She was left in the safe hands of C.H. Paital, the headmaster of the school. It was at Kannanur that another great master fired her imagination so much that together they achieved the impossible. His name was Madhavan Nambiar. By 1977, Usha and Nambiar were inseparable. Nambiar had found the ward he had been waiting for all his life, and Usha had found her guru. Nambiar would from now on care for her like a father. Usha's meticulous systematic training began in earnest. Usha had regular training run on the beach of Paioli. She preferred to be trained alone, for the vastness of the beach gave her a sense of freedom. She ran joyfully and freely, and she derived her strength from the serenity and peace of her beloved Kerala surroundings. Nambiar introduced his sand training in her program to enhance her performance in the athletics just after the 1982 New Delhi Asian Games. Sand training had enhanced the performance of many great athletes, from Edwin Moses to top-flight Indian athletes like Milkha Singh and Sriram Singh. Usha's athletic achievements are well known to almost all Indians: 2 silver medals in the 1982 New Delhi Asian Games, 4th place in the 400 meter at the 1984 Jakarta Asian Meet, and 4 golds and 1 silver at the 1986 Asian Games in Seoul. P.T. Usha's story is that of a gifted child from humble origins achieving international success through sheer dedication and immense hard work. Never in the history of independent India has a youngster from a remote background town of rural origin caught the imagination of youth in particular and the public in general as Usha has, said a professor of English in Usha's hometown. Children, listen to the lesson once again and then read on your own. The seventh poem in our English textbook is Indian Cricket Team. Let us start reading the poem. When the umpire puts the toss, Dhoni is the boss. When Gambhir hits a century, Jet Li goes for a knee injury. When Sehwag hits the ball to the fence, Ponting becomes tense. When Taylor's runout is taken to the third umpire's decision, he loses his batting position. When India is in need of a run, down goes the blazing sun. When India gets the cup, they raise it up. Children, listen to the poem once again and read it on your own. Ranji's Wonderful Bat is the next lesson in extensive reading of our textbook. Let's start reading the lesson. How's that? Shouted the wicket-keeper, holding the ball up in his gloves. How's that? Echoed the fielders. How? Growled the fast bowler, glaring at the umpire. Out, said the umpire. And Suraj, the captain of the school team, was walking slowly back to the tool shed at the far end of the field. The score stood at 53 for 4 wickets. Another 60 runs had to be made for victory, and only one good batsman remained. All the rest were bowlers who could not make many runs. It was Ranji's turn to bat. He was the youngest member of the team, only 11 but strong and bold. Ranji prepared to face the bowler. The hard, shiny red ball came speeding towards him. Ranji was going to leap forward and play the ball back to the bowler, but at the last moment he changed his mind and stepped back, planning to push the ball through the ring of fielders on his right or offside. The ball swung in the air, shot off the grass, and came through sharply to strike Ranji on his pads. The umpire raised a finger. Out, he said, and it was Ranji's turn to walk back to the tool shed. The match was won by the visiting team. Never mind, said Suraj, patting Ranji on the back. You'll do better next time. But their cricket coach was more strict. You'll have to make more runs in the next game, he told Ranji, or you'll lose your place in the side. Avoiding the other players, Ranji walked slowly homewards. He was very upset. He had been trying so hard and practicing so regularly, but when an important game came along, he failed to make a big score. On his way home, he had to pass Mr. Kumar's sports shop. He liked to chat with the owner or look at all the things on the shelves: footballs, cricket balls, badminton rackets, hockey sticks, and balls of various shapes and sizes. Mr. Kumar had been a state player once and had scored a century in a match against Tanzania. But this was one day when he did not feel like stopping. He looked the other way and was about to cross the road when Mr. Kumar's voice stopped him. Hello, Ranji. Why are you looking so sad? Lost the game today? Ranji felt better as soon as he was inside the shop. Yes, we lost the match. Never mind, said Mr. Kumar. What would we do without losers? Anyway, how many runs did you make? None. A big round egg. I haven't made a good score in my last 3 matches, said Ranji. I'll be dropped from the team if I don't do something in the next game. Well, we can't have that happening, said Mr. Kumar. Something will have to be done about it. I'm just unlucky, said Ranji. Maybe, but in that case, it's time your luck changed. Mr. Kumar began looking closely at a number of old cricket bats, and after a few minutes he said, Ah, and he picked up one of the bats and held it out to Ranji. This is it, he said. This is the luckiest of all my old bats. This is the bat I made a century with. He held it out to Ranji. Here, take it. I lend it to you for the rest of the cricket season. You won't fail with it. Ranji took the bat and gazed at it with awe and delight. It is really the bat you made a century with? He asked. It is, said Mr. Kumar. It may get you 100 runs too. Ranji spent a nervous week waiting for Saturday's match. He asked Koki, the girl next door, to bowl to him in the garden. Koki bowled quite well. At last, Saturday arrived, bright and sunny. Just right for cricket. Suraj won the toss for the school and decided to bat first. The opening batsman put on 30 runs without being separated. The visiting fast bowlers couldn't do much. Then the spin bowlers came on and immediately there was a change in the game. Two wickets fell in one over and the score was 33 for 2. Suraj made a few quick runs and then he too was out to one of the spinners, caught behind the wicket. And it was Ranji's turn. He walked slowly to the wicket. The bowler took a short run and then the ball was twirling towards Ranji. And then a thrill ran through Ranji's arm as he felt the ball meet the bat. Crack! The ball hit firmly with the middle of Ranji's bat, streaked past the helpless bowler and sped towards the boundary. 4 runs. And that was only the beginning. Now Ranji began to play all the strokes he knew. He sent the fielders scampering to all corners of the field. 20 minutes after lunch, when Suraj closed the innings, Ranji was not out with 58 and Ranji's school won the match. On his way home, Ranji stopped at Mr. Kumar's shop. We won, he said, and I made 58, my highest score so far. It really is a lucky bat. The eighth lesson in our English textbook is half the price. Let us start reading the lesson. Once there lived a fisherman in a town near the Arabian Sea. He was a wise old fisherman. Here is a story about him. The fisherman had a daughter. She was 17 years old. That was the age of marriage for girls in those days. So the fisherman was looking for a good bridegroom for his daughter. He found several young men, but he did not have enough money to get his daughter married to one of them. Some of his friends advised him to see the Raja who ruled the town and ask him for help. He was ready to take their advice, but he did not wish to go to the Raja without any gifts. He wished to take with him a gift that was good enough for the Raja. What gift could a fisherman give except fish? But this fisherman was too old to go far out into the sea. Every day he saw several big fish in the sea and tried to catch one, but he failed. Then one day he was lucky. A very big fish fell into his net and he immediately set off for the Raja's palace with great joy. But at the palace gate, the gatekeeper stopped him. Gatekeeper, you cannot go in. Fisherman, but I must see the Raja. I wish to give him this fish as a gift. Gatekeeper, you need not give him any fish. He has enough fish for several days. Fisherman, but I must speak to the Raja. I want to speak to him about an important matter. Gatekeeper, you need not speak to the Raja. You can speak to me instead. Fisherman, I do not wish to speak to you about it. Gatekeeper, why can't you speak to me? Is it a secret? I can keep secrets. Fisherman, you need not keep my secret and you must not stop me here. Everyone in the town can see the Raja at any time. The Raja himself said so. I hear. Gatekeeper, but I am sorry, you are wrong. The Raja has ordered me not to let anyone in now. I must obey his order. I will not let you in. Fisherman, please let me in. I must see the Raja and give him this fish. Gatekeeper, do you want to sell him the fish? What is its price? Fisherman, I am not selling it. I am giving it to the Raja. Gatekeeper, but still, he will certainly pay a good price for it. Now shall we divide the money between us? Will you give me half the price? Fisherman, how can I do that? Gatekeeper, you need not do that and you need not go in now. Fisherman, what shall I do now? Gatekeeper, You can do one of the two things. Either agree to give me half the price or leave this place and go home. The fisherman stood there for some time thinking. Fisherman, will you take half of anything that the Raja gives me? Gatekeeper, he will give you either gold or silver. What else will he give you? Fisherman, I don't know anything about that. Answer my question. Will you take half of anything I get from the Raja? Gatekeeper, yes, I shall take anything. Now you can go in. Fisherman, thank you very much. I shall certainly give you half the price I get for this fish. The fisherman appeared before the Raja with his big fish. He placed the fish with great respect at the Raja's feet. Fisherman, I have long wished to see your highness and pay my respects to you, but I did not come till now because I was not able to find a gift that was good enough for you. Today I was lucky enough to catch this. Raja, what is your name, my man? Fisherman, my name is Jalraj, your highness. Raja, I have heard of you. All fishermen respect you and say that you are the wisest among them. I respect all good and wise men among my people. So please sit down and tell me everything about this fish. Fisherman, it is a fish that lives in deep sea far below the surface of the water. It sometimes comes up and jumps several feet above the water. It came up this morning and fell into my net. Now it is here before you. Send it to your cooks immediately and you will enjoy your dinner today. Raja, stay for dinner and enjoy it with us, my man. I invite you to dine in the palace today. Now what shall I give you in return for this gift? Fisherman, nothing, your highness. Your highness and everybody in the palace must enjoy my gift. That is all I want. Raja, no, that is not enough. You must take something in return. Fisherman, then will your highness give me anything I ask for? Raja, yes, anything. Fisherman, then please order your men to give me 200 lashes with a whip on my back. Raja, what a strange request this is. People say you are a wise man, but I don't think your request shows any wisdom. What fun will you get out of lashes on your back? Fisherman, you and your men can get some fun watching the man lashing me. Raja, but I don't want to have such fun. Ask me for something else. Fisherman, I do not wish for anything else, your highness. Raja, all right then, you will have your lashes. Are you ready for them? Fisherman, yes, I am, your highness. But please call your gatekeeper in. The Raja sent his men to the gatekeeper and in a few moments he appeared. Fisherman, your highness, please give this man 100 lashes out of the 200 lashes that you have promised me. Gatekeeper, what? 100 lashes? Why must I share this punishment with you? Fisherman, we agreed to divide the price of the fish between us. You wanted half of anything I got from the Raja in return for it. I am getting 200 lashes from him, and half of 200 is 100. Raja, not 100. Give that gatekeeper all the 200 lashes and dismiss him from my service. I feel ashamed because I kept such a bad servant all these days. You are indeed very wise, my good fisherman. This man was trying to cheat you. You have very clearly brought punishment on him. I wish to give you a good reward for your cleverness and wisdom. Ask me anything. Fisherman, I have a daughter and I must soon give her away in marriage. I am very poor. Raja, bring here the bridegroom of your choice. I shall get her married. Fisherman, I thank your highness. Children, listen to the lesson once again and then read it on your own. The Sheikh's White Donkey. This is our last lesson in our extensive reading of our textbook. Let's start reading the lesson. I was traveling across the desert with Sheikh Mohammed bin Musa and his caravan of 90 camels and 19 men. The Sheikh was a dignified old man with fierce dark eyes and a wide beard. He rode a large white donkey and his donkey was dignified too. The Sheikh treated him as a friend and an equal. They were almost always together all day. They slept in the same tent every night. I was carrying with me about 80 pieces of gold in a leather bag. I kept the bag in my tent at night and every morning I checked it to see that the pieces of gold were safe. On the ninth morning, the bag was not there. I went at once to the Sheikh and complained to him about the loss of my bag. He sat in silence for a few minutes, stroking his beard. At last he said, "The caravan will not leave this camp today. Before evening comes, you will have your gold." After lunch, the Sheikh went to his tent and closed the flap of the tent behind him. After dinner, my host slowly came out of his tent and sent for me. He told me to sit up near him in front of his tent. Then he said, "Bring me the men." All his men stood in a row in front of him. When all the men were there, the Sheikh spoke. "Today some trouble has come to my guest, this traveler. Someone has stolen his bag of gold. Stealing is a crime and to steal from a guest is 7 times worse. As no one from outside has been near our camp, the man who stole the bag is standing before me now. He thinks he can hide his crime, but I can find him out with the help of my wonderful donkey. My white donkey," he continued, "is not an ordinary one. He is a wise animal. My donkey cannot speak our language, but I can understand his language. He'll soon tell me who stole your bag." Then he looked at his men and said, "Now I order each of you to go into the tent alone. Close the flap of the tent so that no one can see you except the donkey and God. Pull my donkey's tail. When an innocent hand touches his tail, he will be silent. But when the hand of the thief touches his tail, the donkey will speak to us all in his language. We will take the thief and kill him without mercy." As soon as he finished, he ordered the last man in the row to go into the tent first. He went in and came out. All the others went in and came out. Nothing happened. I thought that the donkey was not so wise after all. But Muhammad bin Musa said to me quietly, "Don't worry, it is all right. You'll get your gold soon." I wondered how. Musa asked all his men to stand in a line. "Hold your hands in front of you with the palms up," he shouted. Each man held out his hands. The Sheikh then walked slowly to the row. He bent down and laid his face on the palms of each one's hands. I was amazed when he did this again and again. He came to the 12th man and laid his face on the man's palms. Suddenly he lifted his face, pulled out his sword and shouted, "You dirty thief, get that gold or I'll kill you at once." The man fell on his feet begging for mercy. Then he jumped up and ran outside the circle of camels. He pulled up a stone and came back with my leather bag of gold. "Give it to the traveler," shouted the Sheikh. The man put the bag into my hands and I found that all the 80 pieces were in it. Then the Sheikh ordered 2 men to beat the thief. After a minute I begged mercy for him and at my host's command the men let him go. I was eager to know how the Sheikh found the thief. The next day I asked him to explain. He looked at me and said, "You must not tell my men." "Certainly not," I said. "Well, yesterday when I was in the tent, I took some mint and put it in water. When the water began to smell like mint, I put the donkey's tail into the water. The tail too smelled like mint. That evening, you remember, each man went into the tent and pulled the donkey's tail. All of them except the thief pulled the tail. His hand alone had no smell of mint upon it. It was all in praise for the Sheikh's wisdom.
You